So we have this game series, right? It's a 3D RPG with a medieval western fantasy art style. There's swords, shields, magic, archery, and the like. This game currently has 3 installments in its series, and as such, I'll refer to each of them as 1, 2, and 3. 1 is usually described as the best in the series, and for good reason. While 3 was extremely good, it fails to capture what made 1 so special. We don't talk about 2 really. In fact, I consider it to be more of a spin-off than a sequel, or perhaps some sort of fanfiction. It is worth mentioning that 2 takes place in a different setting compared to 1, and its story is a bit more contained or isolated, only referenced lightly in the 3rd even though it didn't really need to be. If someone had skipped 2 and played 3, they wouldn't even notice that this was a nod to the 2nd game. Speaking of skipping 2, that's something you could do without consequence. People don't really need to play the 2nd game at all to understand the connection between 1 and 3. And since the story of the 2nd game can't rest on the shoulders of the 1st, the story ends up feeling short and anticlimactic. Other than that, it was a bit of a cleanup in graphics and smoothness of gameplay. It's not a bad game, it's just isn't as great as the others. And that's all I have to say on it. 1 had a much more strategic and slower approach to combat, partly due to its difficulty and or technical limitations at the time. 3 seems like it was engineered to appeal to more action-oriented players, or in other words, a larger audience. The choice to go more action-y may stem from another game that the devs made just before the 3rd, and implemented some aspects of the combat from that over to 3. This turns out to be a problem for some, since it's really a departure from form. Now you could still play 3 like you did 1, but it's doable without as many tactics involved. There were a couple of aspects in the crafting system that were thrown out by the 2nd and 3rd games, and that's an improvement. The level up system in 1 doesn't seem to be as polished, as some stats are clearly better than others. So much so that you can go without leveling a whole list of stats and have it not affect your playthrough in any way. By the time 3 rolls around, the leveling system is much more streamlined. But as a result, you don't feel much stronger between each level, and the progress is more gradual throughout the course of the game in comparison to the bursts of power you may feel in 1. The first game forces you to progress through its world primarily by foot, encountering obstacles in the way between major plot points and key areas. This adds a fair amount of pacing and progression to the story, as well as setting up the world geographically. However, this ends up missing in the other games, due to the rushed and outright lazy teleporting system that you have access to right from the start. In 1, the camping state was something that you looked forward to out of desperation, and for a moment of respite before you take on whatever unknown challenge you'll face next. It's different in 2 and 3. In 2, the home base is more like a central hub, directly integrated into the world. And other than that, it's just a place to stay before you go on to your next quest. In 3, your home base is actually separate from the rest of the world. It is a rather useful rest and resupply area, and the best place to meet other important characters. But it's just not the same as setting up camp on the road. Chronologically, 3 takes part after 1, with the areas and continents still existing from the first game, but affected by the first main character's actions. The first also has by far the best story. It's a tale of a single person who was chosen for a higher purpose, and you take them on that journey from rags to riches, along with unrecognized glory. Many people will and do forget what the first main character did for the world by the time 3 rolls around. Basically, the 3rd game is about the continuation of the legacy set forth by the first main character. Furthermore, the main character of 1 is dead by the time 3 happens. The boss from 3 is technically an altered version of the same final boss from 1, it's just apparently more powerful this time. There's a few characters that literally show up in both 1 and 3. One of these characters is this guy in 1 that seems just like a total nobody NPC that you shouldn't expect to see again. But wait, he shows up in 3 and is probably one of the most critical NPCs in the game. Seriously though, your character's chances of completing their mission would have dropped dramatically if this guy didn't just randomly return. Also, the lives of your companions do not revolve around you in 1. They can leave and disappear of their own accord. Unlike in 3, where the companions only really leave by command of the player, or when the plot dictates. This adds a sort of tension in 1 that's not replicated in 3. 3 seems to enjoy making as many references to 1 as seemingly possible, sometimes to an absurd degree. The DLC in 1 also adds some story elements that clarify what happens at the end to certain characters. And in 3 you have a specific character that seems to know way more than anyone else, possibly more than the player character themselves. They're like, hey, let me help you become an awesome leader, because I think you're totally cool. And yeah, they may end up appearing as a major character in a sequel someday. The first game did a much better job at setting up the world, making it feel lived in and realistic. This is in spite of the despair that surrounds those who live in it. The game makes it clear that there is different continents, cultures, and people, even if you never actually see these places. Eventually, you can meet characters that come from different lands, and you see just how defined the cultures are in the game world. And there's kings, of course, some of which you actually encounter. Furthermore, it seems like both people and objects were placed in specific areas, as to make the player think that logically, the location of said object makes sense within the game world. Lastly, the game's lore is as thick as crude oil, but like gold, you have to search it out thoroughly before you fully understand the stories behind the world. The main enemy type the player encounters will be some weird humanoid creatures. They're ugly, don't speak, don't require food to eat, and they look to slay any human they see, especially the main character. Are they human? No. At least, not anymore. There's stories of a curse that may have caused these beings to become what they are, but their origin doesn't really matter as much as the overwhelming threat they embody. After all, we never see how a normal person becomes one of these creatures. Oh yeah, and there's dragons, because of course there's dragons. And don't forget demons, which are objectively bad. They're born out of some weird corruption process, and they seem to have no desire to help humans in any way. On the opposite hand, there are gods, which aren't objectively bad. However, there's a few people that follow them and a few that turn their backs on them. Oh, but they exist. They just tend to watch from afar, only taking action in specific instances. The ending of 1 requires you to make a decision, and there's pretty much no good choice. You can be a hero and sacrifice yourself to save the world, or you can preserve yourself by finding a loophole. This turns out to not be that much of a better choice, especially since the advice is taken from a rather shady character, and you have no idea what happens after you take this supposed loophole. You could quite literally be signing away your soul by going through with it, and there's no way of knowing without actually doing it. All in all, it's a good game series that's received much success, and I consider it one of my favorites. But which game am I talking about? My name's Aeon, thanks for watching.